I'm going to open this video by saying I was genuinely excited for this game. I enjoyed the first one for the most part. It did have some issues that annoyed me, but I would definitely say it was a solid game to say the least. Its story, gameplay, music and pacing, just everything was good. And that's what I'm most thankful for the first game, because the original Last of Us made me realise how bad Part 2 really was. To say the least, Part 2 is a step back in some regards and it's a quantum leap backwards in others, to the point where fans are actually asking for this game to be non-canon. And I'm not even a huge fan of the series, I'm just a bystander who enjoys video games and appreciates good game design and writing. With all that said, here's my critique of The Last of Us Part 2. In my opinion, there's two main components to any game, story and gameplay. Lots of games only really focus on one of these components. Dark Souls, for instance, is very gameplay heavy, where most people would buy it for the gameplay. Then there's other games that are very focused on story and just let the gameplay suffer. Something like the Walking Dead Telltale series would be very story heavy, and its gameplay is just a bit lackluster. Every game has to have at least one of these to cultivate a following, and that's what made the original such a hit for people. It had both of these, hence it was nearly a cult-like fanbase. Which is fair enough, the game takes a lot of boxes. The gameplay of the original had a knack to it, and it required learning of mechanics to be prosperous, and the story was something that pulled at the heartstrings of people. It was a redemption story between a father and a surrogate daughter. A story like that is always something to give a positive feeling to the player. Part 2, however, changes the formula, and it bases around a negative feeling of revenge. Just personally, I think a positive feeling of redemption trumps negative feelings like revenge every time, from the perspective when you're trying to get an audience emotionally invested anyway. And in general, it just didn't hit me in the feels the same way that the original did. Just a heads up, I'm going to talk about both story and gameplay throughout this review. For now I'm going to talk about story, and later on I'll get into gameplay. So just so you know, the spoilers are going to start from this point on, so I'm going to give you fair warning to switch off the video now. My first issue regarding the story of this game is the timing of Joel's death. Overall, I think his death is a good move story-wise. It was the only death that would have any meaning in the story aside from Ellie, but they couldn't kill her as she's the playable character, so that just leaves Joel. However, it was not a justified death for the character. Joel was a character everyone can identify with. He has had a traumatic life and hasn't been able to deal with that trauma. He wants to redeem himself and to have a second chance at being truly happy. A genuine character like that deserves to go out swinging, or at least have a noble sacrifice. What they did to that character wasn't only insulting to him, but it spat on the face of him as well, and he literally gets spat on in this game. Also, just a sidebar, I just refuse to believe that Joel and Tommy would believe a stranger and just allow themselves to get trapped like that, but anyway, that's neither here nor there. After which, Joel gets massively degraded by the character that's essentially going to replace him, Abby, but I'll talk a bit more on that later. But this happens to the point where I was actually getting a bit angry that this story choice was made so early in the game. To take a character that they spent so long building up, have a redemption arc, and then die in the first 2 hours of the game, it was just a middle finger to the fanbase. It's nearly like the first game didn't happen. Again, I said this before, I'm fine with the death of the character, if the game concluded with it, but it didn't, so I'm just left feeling cheated by the game. After Joel's death, Tommy sets out to avenge him and Ellie follows. The middle part of the game is mainly focused around Ellie following leads to lead to the WLF, Tommy, and ultimately Abby being Joel's killer. This is broken up by flashbacks with Joel progressively becoming a better father figure to Ellie, and these parts were what kept me interested. They were genuinely heartfelt and they're exactly what the fans loved about the game, which is Ellie and Joel forming a father-daughter relationship and completing each other's lives. A positive emotional response with character progression as the series develops. This is what creates good story and makes players feel good. These sections are forced walking sections though, and generally these are bad in the game. It's kind of the same as like escort missions, but not quite as annoying. But they were fine here as they had such an emotional response. I will give credit where it's due. Naughty Dog does force walking sections well, I'll give that to them, and that's quite difficult to work into a game. It reminded you what you loved about the first game. It's the equivalent of seeing the good guys win, it just makes you feel good. It makes you see the journey between Joel and Ellie to becoming content with the world they live in, but knowing that Joel is dead just makes these flashbacks seem a bit meaningless because the player didn't personally experience them directly via story progression. It was just a flashback to a point in the past. It feels like there was a game in between part 1 and part 2 that I didn't play, and after experiencing those flashbacks it just made me feel like the game was ordered a bit backwards. It's like they started the game in the present, then jumped to where the game should end, Joel's death, then flashback to the past to describe their relationship, and then brought you back to the present. It's not complicated narrating, it just adds needless convolution. My opinion on what should have happened is someone else should die at the beginning in a similar way. Let's just say Tommy's beaten to death and Joel and Ellie set out for revenge. Joel would have a personal stake in this and Ellie comes out of obligation. Along the way, Ellie would slowly forgive Joel for lying to her, and you experience that journey with them directly. That story would have linearity and it's a lot easier to tell, but that's neither here nor there. What they did though is they showed flashbacks of that journey after the fact of Joel's death, so you experience the progression indirectly and it doesn't have the same emotional impact. They showed Ellie going back to the hospital from the first game and having a conversation with Joel about what really happened regarding the development of the vaccine. They also show Ellie wanting to work towards forgiving Joel one day. But all this is artificially shown via a flashback and it's second-hand information. It's like I experienced the movie through someone describing it to me. It just doesn't have the same impact. But I'll get to what I think should have happened a bit later. So on this journey, Ellie kills most of the characters that were there when Joel died, and a few characters and random info gets introduced, like Jessie shows up and Dina is pregnant, which is just plot fodder. It doesn't really add anything to the game, as Jessie dies anyway and Dina leaves Ellie regardless, so it's just useless info, it means nothing. They introduced these disposable characters where they showed up, they get killed off halfway through the game and the other one just leaves at the end. It's just lazy writing in my opinion. Eventually Ellie catches up to Tommy after killing all the members except Abby, and then they prepare to leave, but not before Abby finds them, and this is where the character switch happens to Abby. This is where the player starts on Abby's journey and leads up to the point where Ellie's story is concluded. The purpose of this section of the game is to help the player understand why Abby killed Joel. This is inherently flawed, as there isn't a justification for killing the character that people loved in the way that she did it. No amount of Abby backstory can justify Joel's death, period. The more I played as Abby, the more I realised that she was exactly Joel's character from the first Last of Us 1, except more poorly written. A character that had a difficult life but seeks redemption. I mean, just look at the parallels between the two. Abby is a woman who's had a difficult life and takes the endearing bow-wielding adolescent, Lev, under her wing. Then there's Joel, who also had a difficult life and takes the bow-wielding adolescent, Ellie, under his wing. Not only that, but Abby has the same abilities as Joel from the first game, like shiv crafting, using ladders, trying to mirror the two even more. To me, this just seems like the creators wanted Abby to take over Joel's role and continue the series from her perspective, with Lev taking on the role of Ellie. Both characters' origins based on a loss, where Joel loses his daughter and Abby loses her father, but there's an inherent issue here that distinctly separates these characters. Personally, I would say the loss of a daughter, in Joel's case, is more traumatic than the loss of a father, in Abby's case. Losing a father still follows the natural order of life, where usually the son or daughter outlives the father or mother. However, when that dynamic is reversed and the infant dies, that's where tragedy seeps in, and that's what makes audiences like Joel more, as they feel a bit more sorry for him. The son-daughter theme is reinforced even further in flashbacks, where Joel teaches Ellie how to swim, how to hunt, everything a father generally does. Joel is trying to make up for lost time, and those scenes demonstrate that. Anyway, back to Abby's story. It follows Abby retrieving Owen and trying to get him back to the WLF base. Abby goes to the aquarium, gets sidetracked on Scar Island, and comes back to the aquarium to find Owen and Mel dead. Again, more disposable characters. Half a game building up a relationship just to kill them off. A lot of our campaign isn't interesting aside from the interaction with Lev. Apart from that, it's very forgettable. There is a point where she has to enter an old hospital and it's ground zero of the infection, and that was somewhat intriguing. Apart from that, her campaign was just a chore. A lot of the environments were recycled from Ellie's campaign also, and it just makes me feel like I've seen it all before. Some of the more epic parts of the game happened here, like truck chases, and there's a part where Abby is chased through the dark by stalkers, and the descent section in general was also very cool, but all of this is really short-lived. A minute to 1 to 2 minutes, or maybe a half an hour for some sections. In the span of a 30-hour game, it's really not much at all. Having the occasional good moment in a game doesn't make it a good game. Being constantly good makes it a good game. Some people said the sniper fight was awesome. It's towards the later end of Abby's story. There were 1 or 2 parts that were pretty cool, but overall it was just a task. All the way through Abby's story, I just wanted the game to end. It just bloated the game needlessly. It just made me feel like Abby's story was just not necessary at all. Another thing I wanted to bring up as well, that it was a problem in the first Last of Us, where they brought in characters and killed them off quickly. The Last of Us Part 2 does this even more so, where literally all of Abby's friends that you spend the entire game building up just get killed off. I know the story is based around the game being killed because it's a revenge story, but Jesus, they brought in 7 characters from Abby's crew, then killed every single one of them after giving them a backstory, even bloating the game more needlessly. They might as well have had a crew just of 2 to 3 to reduce the amount of time lore building characters only to kill them. Abby's was the one that killed Joel, so I don't see the point in adding throwaway characters after that. I actually would have been more okay if that crew of 7 or 8 was reduced to 2 or 3. The only one you really care about at this point is Joel's killer, so Abby. Towards the end, she has a rapport with Lev, and I genuinely enjoy that. It's quite similar to Joel and Ellie, but it just doesn't hit the audience in the same way. The flashback with Abby seeing her father die is sad, but it's not quite as emotional as the opening scene in the original Last of Us where Sarah dies. And they replay that same scene 3 times throughout the game, and by the time I got to the 3rd time, I just kept saying to myself, okay, I get it. If they built a game centered around Abby and Lev with nothing to do with Joel and Ellie, it would actually be pretty decent, but relative to Joel and Ellie, it just doesn't hit the mark the same way. And that's what the main issue with this game is. They tried to draw a direct parallel with Joel and Ellie to Abby and Lev. Maybe in an attempt to continue the series using the same team, but you just can't follow that. The two will always be compared. Abby will always be compared to Joel and Ellie as long as they are in the same game. By attempting to draw a parallel like that, they're the architect of their own demise. They meticulously laid out each character's backstory and proved to themselves that Abby's story just isn't as heart-wrenching as Joel's. Abby killing Joel was like a changing of the guard, and she just isn't as likable as Joel. She isn't a terrible character in a vacuum, but relative to Joel and Ellie, there's just no comparison. With Abby killing Joel at the beginning, it's like she was forcefully replacing the character, like the creators wanted to completely cut out Joel and humiliate him before he left, then restart with Abby, hence disrespecting Joel's character further. After you finish Abby's story, it cuts back to Ellie being a parent with Dina's child for a while, and then she decides to chase down Abby again. When Ellie finally finds her, they duel, and it ends with Ellie showing mercy for Abby and letting her go, and this is what really pissed me off about the ending. Ellie sparing Abby basically makes the entire game pointless. The game's theme was revenge, and this was dropped at the very last second. Ellie lost everything and gained nothing as well. Even if she did kill Abby, that's still bad, as the player just wasted half a game on a character that dies, which is even more pointless. But at least the whole game would have come full circle if Ellie did kill her, and the player would get to kill a character that killed their fan favourite character, which is Joel. So there would have been some kind of payoff. In my opinion, this is how I think the game should have gone. Firstly, if they killed off Joel at the end, and not by Abby, instead of the game's beginning, with a heroic death such as a sacrifice or a narrow defeat. As well as this, is that they had him in the game as your companion up to this point and then die at the end of the game. This would also help. Ideally throughout the game, Ellie forgives Joel for lying and you experience this as a player, not by second-hand information through flashbacks. The other thing I would change is Abby would just be a Firefly, with no ties whatsoever to what Joel did. Abby would still kill someone close to Ellie and Joel, which sets Ellie and Joel off pursuing her, but she is redeemed later for killing a small character. Let's just say this small character is Tommy. Asking for forgiveness for killing Tommy is a much easier redeem, as she only killed a secondary character. And if they painted Tommy for doing something truly awful when he was with the Fireflies and Abby witnessed it, that's an even easier redeem. Abby asking for forgiveness for Joel's death just isn't in the cards for the character. She killed off a fan favourite character and no amount of backstory will recompense for that. In my opinion, that would be a much better leaving off point, as in that case you would have Joel dying a good death. The player went through the journey as Ellie, slowly patching things up with Joel before his demise, and then Abby and Lev could go their separate way. This could possibly open up a series spin-off similar to Uncharted Lost Legacy. But that isn't what happened. The end of the game just left me thinking, what was the point? There was no redemption, no revenge served. It's like they spent the entire game on revenge and then flip-flopped at the end, making the entire journey pointless. You have one main character dead, Joel. Ellie is emotionally broken, and the non-liked character gets to escape, which will most likely get her own DLC. And I'm not mad or anything. I'm just disappointed at all its potential that wasn't realised. The whole game just leaves the player feeling unfulfilled after 20 to 30 hours, and it's just disheartening to see what was wasted. That mostly concludes the story component of this criticism. I'm going to move on to the gameplay for now, which is the better part of the game. The gameplay itself for the most part is okay, so I have less complaints relative to the narrative. It's based on the same template from its predecessor, but somehow worse by being a lot more forgiving in a survival game of all genres. It just seems really odd to me. First of all, I'm going to speak about the graphics and visuals of the game, specifically the environments. There's 3 main exterior environments in this game: snow, green foliage and rain, and desert arid, with about 80 to 90% of the game being the green foliage and rain. Tree environments is an adequate number of environments in the game for the most part. I would have preferred a better split where snow and sun were more prevalent, but that's more of a personal preference, I think. The interior environments, on the other hand, are where the environments really shine. Spore-filled corridors and particle effects are really top notch. I can't speak any more highly of it, even if you consider, especially if you consider the hardware they're restricted to. The standard interior places work fine, like hotels, parking garages, pubs, coffee shops. It's all a diverse array of interiors, and it really gets more and more diverse the more you move through Seattle. In particular, one of the first areas you enter has a lot of optional areas that you can go into, like a bank, and it was one of my favourite parts of the game, and I really wish they had more of it in the later parts. There's a few obscure interior environments that on paper seem like an odd choice, but in execution is really great. At one point in the game you're in an abandoned aquarium, and trust me, it's extremely creepy. Exploration feels satisfying where the journey feels worthwhile as you find crafting materials that are just make your life easier in general. Companions always chime in on something in the environment when you see it that's a bit of a spectacle. It makes the environments feel more organic, as both you and your companion interact with it by acknowledging it. Environmental puzzles are very straightforward for 90% of them, with very little challenge. Still, it was better than just finding a key to open a door. They mainly are resolved by breaking a window. It's more of a scavenger hunt for a window than a puzzle per se. Occasionally while you're exploring as well, you'll find a guitar and play a song, which I just found unnecessary for the most part. In saying that, I did find Ellie's cover of Take On Me to be very romantic. The combat, on the other hand, feels like a tiny bit of a step back from the last game, but I'll get into that in a sec. Shooting in general feels very satisfying. Enemies react a lot to it. It's good game design to make the player feel as though their attack actually has impact. A knockback animation or armor falling off gets rid of any bullet spongy issues, and it's just good gameplay design, so kudos to Naughty Dog for that. Getting shot feels like you're getting hit by a car, which is good, even if your health bar doesn't reflect that. Bows, on the other hand, for some reason hit you like a train and knock you back and slowly reduce health if you don't pull the arrow out, which doesn't really make much sense to me, but you know, video games, so I'll just deal with it. Whenever someone dies, you hear another enemy call out their name, which was a nice touch, but it kind of feels like the game was forcing me to feel bad for something I was forced to do. The game puts this obstacle in front of me. I'm forced to remove that obstacle, and it makes me bad for removing that obstacle. Dog and master enemies were added just to change things up, but they just felt a tiny bit unnecessary. Adding dogs in general is fine the way they are, but it makes stealth even less of a viable option, as killing them requires to break stealth. As soon as you kill one, the other one gets alerted, so it just makes the whole thing pointless. Regarding the stealth section, combat feels really tense when you break stealth, but it's very easy to kill enemies in general. It's nearly always better to not be stealthy and just going guns blazing. It kind of makes the quality of life improvements like going prone and hiding in the grass unnecessary, as guns blazing is just way more effective and just way more fun. Bear in mind, I was playing on the hard difficulty, which is one down from the highest, so maybe the stealth was more for the New Game Plus difficulties. But if that's the case, it means a game mechanic is tied to difficulty, which is just really poor design. Having an easy difficulty shouldn't make a game mechanic redundant. It's very hard to implement stealth properly in a game, as it's usually pretty binary, where enemies are so overpowered that stealth is the only option, like in games like Styx, Master of Shadows. I really feel like if they crank up the difficulty a lot more in this game, I feel like the stealth would have felt more satisfying. So anyway, using stealth in the base Last of Us game just isn't necessary whatsoever. There's this dogma in game development that if you have an ultimate method of destruction, you will keep using it, and that's how I feel about stealth in The Last of Us 2. Guns blazing is just a much better option, and it's just way more fun. So it just makes you feel like you don't have to use stealth, so you're not going to use stealth. It would be good if they forced it where enemies are heavily armored, but at the moment stealth is just really superfluous in this game. I really feel like I shouldn't have been able to kill 10 or more people by mainly throwing bricks, using a machete and with a handful of bullets. It's a mainstream game, so I shouldn't expect much difficulty wise for the average person. Relative to the original though, it felt way easier. That covers mainly the human enemies. The infected enemies, there is no knack whatsoever to killing them. It's basically just shoot it until they die. I mean, if you look at a game like Dead Space, the main killing method for all the enemies in that game is to dismember them, but the way you dismember every type of enemy is different. With The Last of Us 2, it's literally just shoot them until they die. Infected enemy variation is something they could have improved too. There's runners, stalkers, clickers, shamblers and bloaters in this game. Those are the 5 main type of infected, with stalkers essentially being faster runners that are able to hide, and shamblers essentially being mini bloaters. So in essence there's only 3 infected enemy types. Again, if you compare this to something like Dead Space, they have way more enemy types, and that game is a lot older and had much less of a budget. As well as that, most of the weapon upgrades don't feel like they do a lot, but maybe that was just me. It's probably because you don't have a lot of ammo, and by extension you're not using guns a lot, so you probably don't use it enough to feel the difference. One thing that really annoyed me was the bow's rangefinder, as it basically allows you to not learn arrow drop anymore. Implementing a mechanic that allows you to not learn how the weapon works is just silly. I'm actually really surprised they didn't include that as like a microtransaction or a pre-order bonus, to be honest. At the beginning I said that every good game needs either good gameplay or story, and I stand by that. The Last of Us 2 just did not perform particularly well on either of those fronts. The previous Last of Us did decent in both of these regards, and to be fair, it is a hard act to follow. But even in a vacuum, The Last of Us 2 is optimistically it's average. Relative to the first Last of Us, it's a flat out step back in every regard, much more so regarding story than gameplay. The story was really drawn out, and there was at least 5 to 10 hours of content that was just not needed. They were basically trying to regurgitate aspects from the first game and re-implement them, which is fine. I'm fine with fan service, definitely. But how they did it was so poorly executed. I genuinely felt like I wasted my time in playing this game. The game trips over itself so often as well by hitting the player over the head with small details that mean nothing if the core gameplay is bad. It's essentially focusing on icing when they haven't even got cake yet. What I mean by that is there's a lot of really small details that were put into the game that most people wouldn't even notice. For instance, as you move through the game as Abby, her hair gets longer. That's a nice touch, but when the story and the gameplay need work, people won't care or even notice those kinds of small details. The same can be said for at the start of the game you see a lot of small Easter eggs in Ellie's room. I mean, it's great that they're there, but if the gameplay and the story's bad, who cares? Details like this aren't usually noticed until another playthrough, and just judging by the reviews, I would say that half the players of this game aren't even going to play it more than once. Another thing I think needs to be mentioned is the developer itself, Naughty Dog. I hate bringing up a game developer during a critique, but here I feel it's necessary. Like, some people would probably say, oh, critique the game, not the company. Well, think of it like this. If I bought some bad cocaine from my local drug dealer, I wouldn't blame the chemist who made it. I'm obviously going to blame the dealer. Just like here, Naughty Dog needs to be criticised for releasing an average game, and to that end, poorly treating their staff as a result. 70% of Naughty Dog's team left in the middle to end of development of this game, and it really shows in the final product. The Naughty Dog that people love are long gone now. It happened with BioWare with Mass Effect as well as the Dragon Age series, and now we will most likely never get a sequel to those games to the same caliber as the original. Now it's happened with The Last of Us, and it's a real pity we couldn't get more games in the series with the good team. The Naughty Dog who made the greats like the Uncharted games and the original Last of Us are long gone now. One particularly bad loss was Amy Hennig, who wrote Uncharted 1 to 3 and got that franchise off the ground. At least she started her own studio, and hopefully that does well. Ideally, Naughty Dog will get some good replacements to replace the 70% purge, but I'm very skeptical. Between falsely advertising aspects of this game and 70% of the team leaving, it leaves me thinking that I don't want to support a studio like this, especially if the game ends up average as this one was. For those that didn't know, they implied Joel would be in the game for the long haul with Ellie, but they totally bait and switched this by replacing him with Jesse in the cutscene. They knew there would be uproar if Joel died so early, so they hid it. Anyway, that's all I really wanted to say in this critique. Don't buy this game unless it's heavily discounted. It really isn't worth your money, and it definitely is not worth your time. There's other studios out there who make better games, and I implore you to support them. And I'll list off a few here. Thanks for watching this far. It's my first review, and I want to do more of them in the future, as I enjoy pointing out good and bad game design. I'll get better the more I do, so the next one will be stepped up from this quality wise again. Thanks for watching, guys. Really do appreciate it. Take care of yourselves. Best of luck.